everyone. Welcome back for another deep dive. You know, we're always on the lookout for fresh perspectives, especially when it comes to these really complex issues. And today, well, we've got something that might just flip the script on how we think about peace processes altogether.
Yeah, this one's definitely got some unique angles.
It really does. So we've been digging into this proposal called PazyFrAm. And at its heart, it's asking a pretty radical question. What if we shifted the focus away from the usual political actors and instead centered the voices of those most impacted by conflict, the victims themselves?
Right, because traditionally it's always been about, governments, negotiators, these big players trying to hammer out agreements.
Exactly. But what if those who've actually experienced the violence firsthand, what if their perspectives were the driving force? That's the big idea here. And our main source for this deep dive is a YouTube video transcript from a channel called, well, it's a mouthful, PazyFrAm. La paz es un derecho y deber obligatorio. Recorded on April 5th, 2025.
Oh yeah, I saw that one pop up. It's been generating some buzz, particularly in light of all the recent discussions around how to approach groups involved in violence.
For sure. And it's interesting because the video even touches on the context of those alleged comments by Gustavo Petro, regarding the Tren de Aragua, the whole idea of treating them with amor to prevent further violence.
Yeah, that raised a lot of eyebrows.
No kidding. But here's the thing. This PazyFrAm proposal, it actually predates those comments. The core document was put together way back in early March, and it offers a much more nuanced perspective than just saying, oh, let's love our way out of conflict.
Okay, so what's the gist of this PazyFrAm thing then?
Well, the foundation, as we understand it, is built on this concept of paz, fraternidad y amor, peace, fraternity, and love, hence the acronym PazyFrAm. But it goes way deeper than just those words.
I'm intrigued.
Right. What really sets it apart is this framework they call a scale of consciousness. And this, honestly, this is where it gets fascinating.
A scale of consciousness. All right, lay it on me.
So it's almost like, imagine a spectrum. And it maps out different levels of, I guess you could say, internal states. And they argue that individuals caught up in violence, whether it's terrorism, armed groups, crime, they're often operating from these lower levels of consciousness.
Okay, so what are these, levels?
Well, they use terms like demonic, animal, emotional.
Wow. Starting pretty intense there.
Yeah, it's a stark picture. But then as you move up the scale, it goes to reason and then love. And ultimately it culminates in these states they call ego annihilation and illumination.
So journey from the depths to a higher state of being.
That's the idea. And the key takeaway is that when people are stuck at those lower levels, they're not accessing reason. They're not accessing love in their decision making. And that's where the conflict arises.
I see. So this PazyFrAm, it's about shifting the consciousness, elevating it, moving people, maybe even whole societies, towards peace, fraternity, and love.
You got it. And a crucial piece of this is their hypothesis that unmet needs, unfulfilled desires, those can trap individuals in those lower states of consciousness.
Yeah, that resonates. You see it all the time. People feeling marginalized, desperate. You can lead to anger, violence.
The video even gives the example of individuals in rural areas, maybe they have limited opportunities, and they end up joining armed groups. It's not just about them being aggressors, it's a consequence of systemic failures, political, economic. It's a form of victimhood in itself.
Right, a product of their circumstances.
And this ties back to Petro's comments about treating those groups with amor. The PazyFrAm folks, they make a clear distinction here.
Yeah, good, because just showering perpetrators with love, that's not a real solution when you're dealing with serious crime.
Exactly. Amor might be this high ideal, but the proposal isn't naive. It's about victim-led peace processes. Empowering those who suffered harm, their voices, their needs, those become the driving force, not the motivations of the perpetrators.
That's a huge difference in approach.
There's this part in the transcript where the proponent describes reaching out to someone who claimed to be a former ELN member involved in social unrest. And they talk about sensing different vibrational frequencies. It's like they're trying to apply this consciousness scale in real-life interactions.
Try and feel out where someone is on that spectrum.
Yeah, it's subjective for sure, but it shows how deeply they believe in these different levels of consciousness and how they shape our interactions.
Fascinating. So it's not just a theory to them, it's something they're actively trying to understand and work with.
Absolutely. But this PazyFrAm thing, it goes way beyond just these individual interactions. They're actually organizing a Red Mundial de Victimas, a global network of victims.
Wow, so they're going big with this. What's the goal?
To change the whole game. Initially, they're focusing on victims within the justice system, prosecutors, judges, magistrates, folks who've seen it all. But the plan is to expand, include victims of politicians, bankers, all sorts of systemic issues.
Okay, so broadening the scope of who's considered a victim in these conflicts.
Right. And they have two main aims. First, to really define and categorize all the diverse ways people experience victimhood. And second, to create clear criteria for how those victims are represented in peace negotiations.
So it's about giving them a real seat at the table, a voice that matters.
Exactly. Shifting the power dynamic entirely. And get this, they even want to link this whole framework to the World Peace Index.
The World Peace Index, that global ranking. How do they plan to do that?
They want to correlate, maybe even establish causal relationships between their PazyFrAm model, including those unmet needs we talked about, and all the different indicators that make up the index.
Interesting. So they're looking at the hard data on peace globally and trying to see how their ideas fit into the picture.
Yeah, and they specifically point out how countries like the U.S., they don't rank that high on the index. And the proponent sees that as pretty significant.
All right. So what kind of indicators are we talking about here?
Well, they list a whole bunch. Number of internal and external wars, the deaths from those conflicts, the UCDP data, level of internal conflict, relationships with neighboring countries.
So the classic markers of, war and instability.
Right. But they also bring up the perceived level of criminality in a society. And they suggest using a really broad definition of criminality, including all reported crimes, not just violent ones.
It's a good point. It gives a more holistic picture of how safe and peaceful a society actually is.
Totally. And then they get into things like the number of displaced persons per capita using the UNHCR figures. And they're careful to point out the need to count internally displaced people, not just those crossing borders.
Yeah, internal displacement is often overlooked.
For sure. Then they get into political instability, respect for human rights, using that political terror scale, the likelihood of terrorist acts, but they suggest quantifying actual acts, too.
Makes sense. You need to look at what's actually happening, not just the potential for it.
Right. Homicide rates, levels of violent crime, the probability of violent demonstrations. It's like they're trying to capture all these different facets of violence and unrest.
Building a complete picture.
Yep. They go on to talk about incarceration rates, the number of police and security forces, even including private security in that count, the ratio of incarcerated people to security agents, military spending as a percentage of GDP, number of active military personnel.
Whoa, getting into the nitty-gritty of, militarization and security apparatuses.
And it doesn't stop there. Imports and exports of major weapons, funding for UN peacekeeping missions, the availability of heavy and light weapons, it's comprehensive.
Yeah, they're leaving no stone unturned. It really speaks to their commitment to understanding the multifaceted nature of peace or the lack thereof.
And beyond all these indicators, the transcript mentions a document that was created around March 31st at a center of tension for human rights violations. About 25 people signed it, and one of the big ideas in that document is creating an index to actually quantify the violation of each human right.
That's a really ambitious undertaking, trying to put numbers on something as complex as human rights violations.
It is. And there's also this intriguing mention of a personal experience the proponent had a couple of years ago. They talk about feeling very kidnapped in a specific location, and they reference a document they created related to that, although we don't get the full details here.
Sounds like their personal experiences are feeding into their thinking as well.
Definitely. And towards the end, they even bring up drug regulation. They propose it as a way to, weaken criminal organizations financially and address related health issues. They emphasize that it needs to be evaluated rigorously with human rights front and center, but they also acknowledge that this isn't their area of expertise.
Interesting. So they're connecting drug policy to this broader vision of peace building.
They are. And finally, they end with this thought about the increasing global tensions, particularly because of scarce resources, something the World Peace Index highlights. And they stress how crucial it is to connect this resource scarcity back to that idea of unsatisfied needs and desires within the PazyFrAm framework.
Makes sense. Competition for dwindling resources.
Yeah.
That's a recipe for conflict.
Exactly. So, this deep dive into PazyFrAm, based on this YouTube transcript, it's revealed a really innovative, multi-layered approach to peace.
Yeah, it's unlike anything I've heard before.
Right. This scale of consciousness, it's definitely unique, might even seem unconventional to some, but it offers a completely different lens for looking at the root causes of violence. And that emphasis on victim-led peace processes, well, that directly challenges the traditional power structures in these negotiations.
It does. It forces us to reconsider who gets to define peace and how we achieve it.
For sure. So, big questions to ponder. Could shifting the focus, putting the experiences of all types of victims front and center, could that be the key to a more lasting peace? And what role does understanding those different levels of consciousness play in making that happen? There's a lot to unpack here. Definitely worth further thought and discussion. Thanks for diving in with me.
Anytime. This is definitely thought-provoking.
It was. Until next time, everyone.